Hello and welcome to the Empaths Summit. My name is Ryan Hasson and I'm going to be delivering a talk to you today, which I'm really excited to give. I want to thank you for joining me and taking the time. It is said the greatest gift one human being can give to another is the gift of their attention. So I thank you so much for that. So my name is Ryan. I run a business down here, down under in Melbourne, Australia called the Centre for Healing. We deal in trauma, mental illness, addiction, stress. We have for many, many years. We treated hundreds and hundreds of clients at our centre. Now we train other therapists in trauma healing modalities. In the work that I've done over the years, I've seen countless empaths come in for therapy. I'm also an empath myself, so we are in very good company. If you're attending the Empath Summit, I'm going to assume you are as well. And now dealing with obviously a lot of therapists and practitioners, these people are generally empaths as well. So I'm going to gear my talk today. I'm going to give you a bit of context in a minute around what I'm going to cover, but really just based on my life experience and what I've been doing for work for many, many years now, I want to share what I have learned and try and condense that down into a shorter presentation as possible, and maybe be able to help you not just understand yourself as an empath better, because so many of the other presenters and talks that you see at this summit will cover that. I really want to talk about how we can understand how we can have an imbalanced life as an empath. See, being an empath has two sides. It is a wonderful gift. It's an incredible service that we can bring to the world when we harness that energy. But when we end up lost and feeling a lot of the negative impacts of that empathetic energy, then we can get really stuck in life. And I want to try and show you how we get stuck and how we can start to free ourselves. So then we are able to give back to the world, which I really feel that an empath at their core is meant to be giving back to the world. So I'll switch over to some slides here. I'm going to be going in between some slides and me talking, and we will go through that way. So let me get this screen up. So why is this important? So really, when an empath heals, they change the world. So over my time and my journey, I've seen so many empaths who are unhealed. Life has got the better of them. They were never taught how to properly harness their energy. They were never taught that they were a little bit different than most other people on the planet. And so what happens, I see so many really unhealed empaths walking around. And there's probably two issues with that. The first issue is that an empath can't truly give their medicine to the world. And I wrote here, a healed empath changes the world. And I truly believe that, because empaths tend to move into roles and jobs and services that really do have a massive impact, not just on the people around them, but on society as a whole. What happens far too often is that when life gets the better of us and we don't really understand ourselves and why we're in this situation, then we accumulate a lot of really heavy energy, emotional energy, from ourselves, from other people, and from the world at large. What I see too often then is empaths end up in a place of resentment because the world has beaten us down, to an extent. We've taken on too much. Instead of loving people, which is what we really do at our core, we end up resenting people. And when we're in a state of resentment, I think Gabor Mate said resentment is soul suicide, and it's a very, very heavy and tough state to be in. So, if you've ever found yourself with those feelings of resentment towards other people or the world as a whole, I'm hoping that this talk will help you understand that a lot better and how you can be free. I've put here, too many have fallen into disempowered states. Empaths are incredibly powerful human beings when they can harness that energy, but the majority that I see are falling into those disempowered states where we are unconsciously, most of the time, giving away our power to other people and other situations, and that in turn ends up seeing so many people struggling with lots of stress, suffering, depression, anxiety, bipolar, coping mechanisms like drug addiction, alcoholism, all of that kind of thing, which we don't have to, just because we fall into that doesn't mean that we have to stay there. We can get ourselves out. So this talk, I'm going to be talking about why. I want you to really understand how being an empath links to trauma, and how we can start to understand those traumatic imprints that we've picked up throughout our life, and how we can eventually be free from those so we can give back as we were meant to. So the roles empath choose and the flow-on effect. So when you look at, and we're going to get into some of the science around the highly sensitive person and things like that, but it seems like empaths or highly sensitive people make up around 15 to 20% of the population. However, there are certain roles, jobs that we move into where those percentages are much higher representation. So things like the arts, people that are artists, musicians, comedians, this kind of thing. There's a very, very high percentage of empaths or highly sensitive people in these industries. And also the industry that I'm in, so many therapists, healers, practitioners of some description, coaches. It's a much higher percentage than 20%. I would say it's well over 50 who get into those fields because of that. The way that we are able to really deeply connect with the world around us, not just the beauty, but also the pain, we are able to then convey that through art or comedy or music or being a therapist to other people, which actually impacts society. Like, it's so incredibly important that enough empaths are harnessing their divine energy so they are able to actually change the structures and the way people show up. It is very, very important. I can't stress that enough. So some inspiration before we jump into things. Let's think about some of the people who were empaths throughout history who were able to harness that power and were able to actually affect massive change in the world. We're talking like people like Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Princess Diana, Oprah Winfrey, Gandhi, Abraham Lincoln, all really self-reported, empathetic people, very sensitive people who, instead of shying away and hiding from the world, they stepped into it and did incredible things and caused massive change, not just to the people that they directly interacted with, but we take inspiration by reading about them now. That's the power that we can have. So now I will come back here and just touch a little bit about me and my story, because it might resonate with some of you in some way. I'm hoping that it does. It'll also give you a bit of a context around why I do the work that I do now. So this is a picture of me on the shoulders of my brother when I was younger, young innocent boy. I grew up in a middle-class family. I had loving parents. We didn't really have too much, materially, but we never went without a hell of a lot either. Two things in my childhood that stand out is one, I would never have known it at the time. I would never have had language for it, but I was a very, very sensitive kid. I was an empath, right? I didn't know. The second thing was, like many families in the 80s, our parents didn't have much emotional capacity, so we never spoke about emotions. Everything was achievement based. Conversations around the dinner table weren't around how we were feeling and what was coming up for us emotionally. It was around, what grades are you getting? Are you playing in the football team this weekend? Did you win that sport game the other day? Very, very achievement based. So it was around the age of about 10, I would say, whereas I started to get these feelings of just deep anxiety and dread on pretty much a daily basis. It would affect the way I showed up at school. It would affect my sport. I ended up stopped playing sport because I couldn't handle the anxiety. Once again, I didn't have any language around this, right? I just knew I had this feeling inside me that was very yuck, and I didn't know how to even label it or speak to anyone about it. So I didn't. I internalized it. And for a lot of you watching who'll know, internalizing those very, very strong emotions doesn't help them, does it? They tend to get worse. So I was dealing with these high levels of dread and anxiety until my teenage years, when I found alcohol. And I found, hang on, this liquid that I drink tends to take away those feelings of fear and dread that are going on. Only for a short amount of time, because as soon as I would stop and the next day they would all come back, but I was getting relief for some time. So I drank a lot throughout my teenage years. I eventually found drugs, and certain drugs that I found, they, instead of it, the alcohol taking away those feelings of dread by 80 or 90%, the drugs completely got rid of it altogether. And that started a love affair with illicit drugs for me throughout my late teenage years and throughout my 20s. Obviously, once again, not knowing any of this at the time, not knowing that I was self-medicating, trying to find a solution to my deep inner problem of having so many emotions and so much energy happening inside me that I had no language for and no one to talk to about. I was using a coping mechanism, an external vice, which is the only way that I knew how. I went through my 20s, what you would call a functional drug addict. I still held down a job. I don't know how. Met a girl, fell in love, got a house and a mortgage. And then that marriage fell apart and we got a divorce. And that was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And I went from functional drug addiction to very, very dysfunctional drug addiction. I ended up living in a drug house, where nobody really slept. People came and went all the time. I was dealing drugs to support my habit. I was using massive amounts every single day. I was in trouble with the law, arrested a couple of times, time in jail, all of that kind of stuff, until I was at a point where I knew that I was going to end up in jail for life or dead. That was the only two options that were really available to me. And so I decided to reach out and get help. And I was very, very lucky in that I found somebody who understood me very early on. And it wasn't through, traditional means of speaking to a counselor or a psychologist. It was actually jumping into my deep internal world, the traumatic imprints I'd accumulated throughout a lifetime. And us empaths, we accumulate a lot. And I'm going to cover why as we move forward. I was very lucky that someone showed me, it's like, look, you have these emotions, guilt, shame, anger, fear, sadness, hurt that have been accumulating throughout a lifetime. You never had a safe space to process them. You didn't know how. And because of that, you're essentially swimming in them. They're taking up all of your energy. And the drugs, the alcohol, that's a way for you to numb them out for a short amount of time. But it's fleeting and they all come back. So I started the deep healing work then of starting to process all these old emotional traumatic imprints from my childhood, my adolescence, up to my marriage breakup, all of these kind of things. And once I started to unpack all of that, the compulsion to escape, the need to use drugs disappeared. I could not believe the change when I was able to actually get in and process a lot of these old traumas. I stopped using drugs from that point. It opened up a whole new world to me where I got really focused on studying and trying to understand, like, how do people end up in suffering and how do I help alleviate that? What are the different methods that people have used throughout history? What works, what doesn't, what works for a certain person and not for someone else? And that led me to a lot of deep inner work, a lot of study. And then myself and my partner, Melissa, who at the time, she's the one who actually helped me out of addiction. We opened up the Center for Healing and we saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients through there where we would, from all walks of life, with great success, helping them work through. And like I spoke about earlier, a large percentage of those people were empaths, whether they knew it or not. A lot of people, especially, blokey kind of guys, probably like I was back in the day, would come in and say, no, I don't have feelings. What are you talking about? And then after a bit of work and a bit of unpacking, there's a lot going on there. And they're a very sensitive human being. One of the point, if you're coming to this summit, you kind of know that you have that nature, that it's in you. So you have that awareness. But a lot of people, that's kind of the first step, is understanding that I do have this nature. Then how do I best move forward from there? What we do now is we teach people and practitioners. So I'll just bring this up. This is when we opened up our center back in the day, talking about my story of addiction and everything and turning that around to try and help people who are in the situations that I was in. I get the classic photo of me against a graffitied wall, former drug addict. It's a classic newspaper thing to do. And so now what we do is we train other people, whether they're psychologists, therapists, healers, practitioners, coaches, people who have a lived experience journey who want to step into helping other people. We train them in trauma therapy, somatic therapies to help them start to help others, resolve those issues that are going on. So the key things I want to jump into, that's enough about me. The key things I want to jump into here is, what is being an empath or being a highly sensitive person. I then want to talk about the impact that traumatic experience has on everybody, but I'll explain after that, especially on empaths. And then I'll start to talk about some of the key components of what happens to us as an empath during a traumatic experience and how we store that in our system and how we accumulate a lot more than other people, which leads to a lot of the negative outcomes that we don't want. And then also some of the key components around how do we start to come out of that? How do we start to lighten the load that we are carrying around so that we can be free and so that we can give that gift to other people and be of service in whatever form that takes for us? So I'm going to touch first on the highly sensitive person. Now, I know this being an empath summit, I'm sure that many other speakers in many other talks will cover this topic. So I'm just going to cover it really briefly here. So Dr. Elaine Aron, there's a few people who have done some good scientific research in terms of this. Dr. Elaine Aron seems to be the most prolific and has the best research out there. She wrote a book on the research that she had uncovered called The Highly Sensitive Person. People kind of hear different arguments like, an empath and a HSP is the same thing, or what are the key there's many blogs like what are the key differences between an empath and a HSP. They're pretty much the same. If there is a difference, it's very, very minimal. So I like to kind of think it like, an empath is more of this, spiritual term. I hear that so much in spiritual circles and that kind of thing, whereas the highly sensitive person is kind of the more scientifically studied or backed version of that. But I see them as pretty much the same thing. And I think it helps to be able to explain it in terms of science, even for the more spiritually minded people. It's also good for the spiritually minded people to explain it to the scientific people, right? We're all after that merger at the end of the day. So I highly recommend picking up her book. You can go to her website. I think she has the HSP quiz on there as well. But basically, there are some characteristics or traits of a highly sensitive person. And this is them there. As I said earlier, 15 to 20% of the population are highly sensitive people. I might just touch on that number in a minute. I think it's really interesting. So we'll just go through these traits here. So I'm aware of the subtleties around me. I become overwhelmed when there is a lot to do. I find noisy and chaotic places overwhelming. I'm affected by others' moods. I'm sensitive to pain, loud noises, and caffeine. I find myself needing to be alone and quiet after periods of activity. I find being observed stressful. I'm deeply moved by poetry, art, music, and the arts. I'm sensitive to another's discomfort. I have a rich inner world and deep thoughts. I avoid violent movies, and I am conscientious. So these are some of the traits of a highly sensitive person. What they all kind of have in common, the way I like to explain it to people, is that we have a very highly attuned nervous system. Our nervous system is far more attuned to the world around us and our inner world than most other people, that other 80 to 85% of people. We feel more. Yeah, we feel more. The good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. And so what happens, I spoke about the roles earlier, the reason why HSPs or empaths start to fall into these roles as artists, musicians, comedians, therapists, healers, is because we act kind of like a bridge. Yeah, it's like a bridge between the real world and other people, and we kind of sit in the middle. That's why you'll find, an empath or a HSP can write a song about one particular tiny little aspect of what it is to be human beings, and everyone feels it, so they just get it straight away. And it's because that person experiences it to the fullest and can convey that to the rest of humanity. And that's why being an empath is so important, being that bridge between this incredible world that we inhabit and everybody else who can't quite feel it as intensely as we can. I think it's a really, really beautiful place to be, although it can feel heavy sometimes. It's really interesting as well, because some of the research that Dr. Elaine Aron has done and is doing is that, so let's say 15 to 20% of humans fall into this category. It also seems to be true in the animal kingdom as well. She's done studies on different species of animal and tends to find that there's like 15 to 20% of an animal population will have this disposition as well. And some of the theories around that are that if that percentage of people are more attuned, it actually keeps the rest of the tribe safe. So like if you imagine, like we evolved in hunter-gatherer societies for the vast majority of our evolution. So if there's a tribe of 50 people, let's say, and that 15 to 20% is a HSP, then, that noise in the woods, or a weird energy from someone in the tribe, or something else going on, that they're more attuned to that and can actually probably alert the rest of the tribe to potential danger, which is actually greatest for the survival of the species. And when it comes to the way that we're wired in our DNA, we are wired for survival. Okay, we are not wired for peace and happiness. We have to take the reins when it comes to that. But if we leave it up to that automatic programming, at the end of the day, we are wired for survival. So the HSPs and empaths are very important in that respect. That's all I want to touch on the HSP. Next thing I want to touch on is this man here. Now I want to talk about trauma from a scientific point of view, which is really, really important. And then I'll end up linking the two together. This man is Dr. Vince Folletti. This is a more recent photo, but back in the 80s, Vince was a young up-and-coming doctor with a passion for helping people and was on a mission to do that. And he was working for a large firm in San Diego, Kaiser Permanente. And they came to him. They had a big hospital and were an insurance firm. And they came to him and said, Dr. Folletti, we need your help. Okay, we need your help with the obese patients that we have at the hospital. And from an insurance point of view, that was the biggest draw on resources. So they said to him, look, can you help us with this obesity problem? We want you to solve the obesity issue. Dr. Vince, as I said, was passionate, fired up, and so he was up for the challenge. And so he did a lot of research and then created a protocol where he could have these obese and oftentimes morbidly obese patients start to come down to a more healthy weight range. So he came up with this protocol where they would come in and eat very little food and get these vitamin IV drips, where they would get everything they needed through an IV nutritionally and eat a certain amount of food, very low calorie, and they would be able to lose the weight. And after speaking to all the people in this program that they had, all of them said, Dr. Folletti, I want nothing more than to be down to a healthy weight range. I don't like being like this. I'm worried about, obviously, shortening my lifespan and all that. So Dr. Vince started this protocol and it was working. Okay, well, it will work if you have people eat bugger all and, go through that they will lose the weight. And so all of a sudden, he was seeing radical changes in most of the people in the program. There was one lady who was 408 pounds and she got down to 135 pounds, which was just this goal that she'd had because she hadn't been that weight since she was 11 or 12. So all these people were getting incredible results, and the exact thing that they wanted, which was get down to a healthy weight range, was happening. What happened next really shocked Dr. Folletti. What happened, he found that most of the people in the program started dropping out. They just wouldn't come in. That he tried calling them and couldn't get onto them, and they were dropping out of the program, even though they were getting the results they said they desperately wanted. And this really confused Dr. Vince Folletti. So he wanted to start to, after a while, bring back these people that had dropped out and just try and work out, what was going on? Why are we dropping out of the program? That one particular lady who went from 408 pounds down to 135, when he finally was able to get onto her 3 weeks later, she'd put on 37 pounds in those 3 weeks, which Dr. Folletti, with his scientific background, he thought that was actually physiologically impossible to put back that much weight. And it's a really interesting story of hers. He interviewed her privately and just said, what happened? And she said we talk about, this unconscious programming and results of trauma. And she has said, I went to bed one night and then I woke up in the morning and I walked out to my kitchen and I thought I'd been robbed. The place was completely ransacked. There was things everywhere. All the cupboards were open, rubbish everywhere. And she realized that in her sleep, unconsciously, she had gone into the kitchen and ate every bit of food that she had in the house. And so Vince Folletti, he said, look, yeah, did anything happen around that time? And she said, yeah, the day before, a man at her work, a co-worker, asked her out on a date. Okay, so a romantic advance, and that brought on this unconscious reaction. And so Dr. Vince just, was asking more and more questions. And he actually, one of the big turning points of eventually leading to this study that I'm going to talk about is actually Vince had some questions to ask the people that dropped out. And with this lady, he asked her, he got his words kind of back to front, and he asked her, at what age did you become sexually active? Which wasn't one of the questions, but it just a question had come out wrong. And she said, I think it was 12 years old. And he goes, what? He goes, yeah, that's when my grandfather started molesting me. This took Vince back because in his years of medicine, he'd only heard of one other sexual molestation case, which is evidence that people don't really open up to their GP. Okay. And so, and that went on for 10 years. And so all of a sudden this older man at her work had hit on her and caused this massive reaction, this trauma response where she put on all the weight, and she ended up putting all the weight back on, up to over 400 pounds. And so this particular answer had Vince go, oh, this, should I be asking the other people this? So he started getting all the people that had dropped out of this study back in. And one of the questions he asked was there any sexual abuse? And a staggering 55% of participants reported being sexually abused when they were younger, and a whole bunch of others reported physical abuse when they were younger. So this got Vince, curious. It's like, what's going on here? Is this eating thing? Could that be a result of this trauma? Could it be some sort of protection mechanism around this? So that got Vince really interested, and he started actually researching into trauma. There was a fellow doctor who was more of an expert in trauma, and he started to research the different types of trauma that people go through. Vince actually went to a conference, and he wanted to actually deliver what he was finding with these patients in this program. And it's such an indictment of the way people see things at the time. But he was basically laughed off stage when he was saying there's a link between trauma and abuse and obesity. And one of the doctors who was in the crowd at the time even put his hand up and said, Dr. Valetti, don't you know that these obese and overweight people are just making an excuse for a failed life? You talk about a lack of compassion. That's evidence of it right there. So he came back after that conference quite deflated around being able to be taken seriously about what he was finding. So he had this colleague in trauma said, look, the only way you're going to get taken seriously is if you can have an actual proper study done and show some results on a larger scale. So Vince said, no problem at all. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of patients at our hospital, and we can work this out. So what they did is they put together a list called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, and it basically has 10 categories. I'll bring it up in a minute here so we can have a look at what those categories are. So this is a questionnaire, and it's basically before the age of 18, did any of the following happen to you? It doesn't go into, the amount of times or that kind of thing. Just did this happen at all? And so, did a parent or other adult in the household, swear at you, insult you, humiliate you, or make you afraid that you might be physically hurt? The next one is around physical abuse from a parent or another adult when you were younger. There's around sexual abuse, where you touched in a sexual way, or did anyone have intercourse with you? Did you often feel like no one in your family really thought of you or thought you were important? And what happened, they put this questionnaire together, and there were 8 categories, but on the further research, they added 2 more to do with neglect, which is so important, because neglect can be just as pervasive. It's like, that trauma isn't just something that happened that shouldn't have. It's also something that didn't happen that should have. So neglect is a very, very important part of the trauma puzzle. So, were your parents divorced or separated? Did you often have feelings of scarcity, like you didn't have enough, like your parents were too drunk or high? Was there domestic violence in the house? So was your mother or stepmother pushed or grabbed or slapped or that kind of thing? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker, alcoholic, or used street drugs? Was there someone who was mentally ill in the household growing up, or someone who attempted suicide? And did a household member go to prison? So basically with this questionnaire, someone goes through that and answers yes or no. Did any of those things happen before the age of 18? So at the end of the day, the person who fills this questionnaire out gets a score of 0 to 10. And you would call that their ACE score. And so what happened, Vince, they put together this questionnaire, and they had everybody that came through their hospital fill it out if they wanted to. And it was somewhat anonymous. And so they had over 17,000 people fill this out. So they had the ACE scores of 17,000 different people. Not only that, being patients of a hospital, they had the medical history of those 17,000 people. So they then went through the process, a very long process, I imagine, of putting together the data of someone's ACE score versus their health outcomes. What have they been presenting with in hospital and to doctors over the years? And they went through that process, and what they got at the end of it was a set of data which was quite astonishing. It was not to be expected, let's say. I'm going to take you through a few of the little graphs here just to give you an idea, an overview of the impact trauma has on someone's health outcomes. Feel free to research it. There's the graphs of all different, maybe 30 or 40 different health outcomes, and they all look pretty similar to these ones I'm going to show you, but it's really, really interesting. So if you look here, basically this is to do with becoming an alcoholic as an adult. So an ACE score of 0 compared to an ACE score of 4 or more, you've got over a 500% chance more likely of becoming an alcoholic as an adult. Just to try and wrap your head around that, a 500% increase. If we found something that we were eating or in the environment that showed a 20% increase in the risk of cancer, it would be all over the news. It would be front page. It'd be all over the television shows, everywhere. We're talking about alcoholism as a 500% increase with that increase in an ACE score. Here's the risk of perpetrating domestic violence in men and women. You can see the increase from an ACE score of 0 to an ACE score of 5 or more. This one here, chronic depression. So the higher your ACE score, the more likely you are to be diagnosed with depression as an adult. So just to give you a bit of an idea, you can see this is this is very rare in science, but this is actually called a step correlation. You can see it kind of looks like a set of steps, but basically a step correlation means that as the dose is increased, so is the effect, and it increases by the increase in dose. But this time we're not talking about the dose of a medication and the benefit that comes. We're talking about the dose of trauma and then the negative health outcomes that come later in life. So here we have, your chances of becoming a smoker as an adult. You can see here once again step correlation with the ACE score. It's absolutely incredible, this stuff. This one here, this is your chance of, or someone's chance of attempting suicide as an adult. If you have an ACE score of 0 compared to an ACE score of 4 or more, it goes up 1,680%. Like, that is mind-blowing, that number. So we're talking about here a lot of, mental and emotional issues arising from trauma, but it's not just that. If you research a bit more, I haven't got time to go into all of it here, but you'll see your chance of getting cancer as an adult, your chance of having heart disease as an adult, your chance of having asthma as an adult, all of this goes up as well with the degree of trauma that we have experienced. I believe the ACE study to be one of the most important scientific studies done in the history of health, not just mental health, and a lot more people should know about it. But they don't, because at the end of the day, it doesn't give us a medication that we can describe. It's like we should be parenting differently and societally bringing up our children in different environments. But, I think it's very, very important to see that. So what I'm getting at here is, let's understand that if we are an empath or a sensitive human being by nature, and we understand the impact that trauma has on mental, emotional, and physical health, I now want to talk about some of the elements of a traumatic imprint, because trauma is very, very subjective. Okay, what is traumatic for one individual will not be traumatic for another individual. Okay, so if we think of things like sexual abuse, that is going to be traumatic for pretty much 100% of people who go through that. But a lot of things that our empaths struggle with is we'll go through things that might not be traumatic for most people, but we store them as a traumatic imprint, which greatly affects us moving forward. And an accumulation of those is going to lead us to feeling heavy. It's going to lead us to being resentful. It's going to lead us to struggling with mental illness, addictions, and stress. Okay, so we really want to understand how that all works. So I'm going to share my screen again here. Okay. So let's talk about the elements of a traumatic imprint. Okay, I'll go through these all first, and then I will give an example of a client which which will be a good one in terms of being an empath. So basically, as we go through an event in life, which all of a sudden we perceive some sort of threat and we have a highly emotional reaction, at that point, it has the potential to become a traumatic imprint that we store. And a lot of the work that I do and that I teach people to do now is we start to unpack these traumatic imprints that people have, and they could have had them for 5, 10, 15, 20. I've worked with people who were unpacking stuff from 40 years ago that is still active in their system because it was still stored as a traumatic imprint. So the first thing that happens is our nervous system goes into overwhelm. So I'm sure you've all heard of fight, flight, and freeze. You can also throw fawn in there if you want. But basically, our nervous system picks up some sort of threat. And it doesn't have to be a threat to our physical survival, just a threat to our identity will start to spark this up. So essentially, our nervous system becomes very active. We come into an activated state. And after that activated state, possibly a shut down state as well. Along with that, we have stored emotional energy and survival stress. So depending on the event that happens, we can have guilt, shame, anger, fear, sadness, hurt, a combination of those, all coming up within our system. And along with that is this survival stress, which is that nervous system saying, threat, we need to act. If we don't have a proper resource in place in that moment, then we will start to interpret that event and what's happening within our body with the creation of some painful narratives, or you might call these core unconscious beliefs around what we think about ourselves and the world. So when I say there's no resource present, what I mean is there's no sense of safety. So our sense of safety, someone or something that we can turn to feel safe in a moment of stress, isn't available to us. And that lack of resource is what turns a potentially traumatic imprint into a traumatic imprint. Let's use the example of, a baby. So, a baby which is completely dependent on its caregiver for its survival is, left in a room by itself and it starts crying. It starts going into a fight, flight, or freeze response. It actually goes into a sympathetic nervous system response, which is very activated because it's trying to get the attention of someone to come back into the room. Because if no one came back into the room, like the baby doesn't know that someone's planning on coming back in half an hour or 10 minutes. It doesn't know. It just thinks if no one comes back, I'm going to die, because that is actually what will happen. That's why it's called survival stress, because it's actually linked to the baby's survival. And so the baby screams, it starts crying, it actually is fear. It actually ends up going into a state of rage, like can't talk, but it's screaming like someone get in here now. And then what will happen if this goes on for long enough, then the baby will actually then go into a shutdown response as a way to try and cope with the event. It will go into some sort of dissociated state. It will go into a parasympathetic and a dorsal vagal, without getting too much into polyvagal theory. It'll go into a dorsal vagal response and it will start to shut down. And what happens, the parent might go, oh, the baby stopped crying, that's great. No, it's not great. The baby has just completely shut down its nervous system as a way to cope with the threat. Whereas if the mother came in initially with the crying and held the baby and became the resource, it can help the baby's nervous system relax. And when you do that enough times, a child, a human being, very young, develops a very healthy nervous system where eventually it'll start to be able to bring itself into a safe space whenever it gets activated. However, most of the Western culture was not brought up that way. Parents were taught to do something different. So we have a massive epidemic right now of developmental trauma in the West, and a lot of it comes from these reactions that I'm talking about. Not having a safe resource. Our nervous system has adapted to not expect a safe resource, so we really struggle whenever we become activated with some sort of threat in our environment. So what happens then with this emotional energy and survival stress? We don't know how to properly process and move through it. There's no resource. So we start to create some sort of belief or narrative. We're trying to work out whatever has happened, what does that say about me and the world? And how can I create a story that might prevent me or buffer me from feeling the same intense pain in the future? So, painful narratives can sound like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of love. I don't love myself. Life is hard. I need approval. I need validation. The world's not a safe place. There's something wrong with me. I don't trust men. I don't trust women. I fear conflict. It's not safe to speak up. we develop these narratives which then become part of our identity and become part of the way that we actually view the world. Those beliefs that we have about ourselves and the world, they filter our reality, and we all have a different set. That's why we're all a little bit different. That's why we all react differently to different situations. It's just a different set of beliefs filtering an objective reality. And so we end up with a lot of these painful narratives, and they are painful because, believing that I'm not worthy of love is going to lead me to a lot of pain in future. I always told people, I had that belief. I had the belief that I'm just not worthy as a human. I'm like, imagine that voice in the head. You're not worthy, you're not worthy, you're not worthy for 20 years. No wonder someone reaches for drugs, alcohol, sex, Netflix, whatever it is, to help try and pacify that. So we create these painful narratives. And then from there, what we do is we kind of encapsulate all that's happened in the event, and it becomes what we would call an orphaned part. So an orphaned part is a part of us that gets created in this moment of a traumatic imprint. And it's we put it out there. It's essentially a split off part of our psyche. So we take this part and put it out here. We do that for two reasons. The first one is if I kind of put it out here and dissociate it to an extent, split it off, it's not as painful to feel the intense emotions that are going on. Also, by putting it out here, this orphaned part is kind of keeping an eye out. From that day forward, it will keep an eye out for something potentially similar happening in order for me to act, right? Now, we don't just have one of these orphan parts. Every human being has a whole bunch of them. But, empaths tend to have a hell of a lot. There is 100 different parts on alert all the time, always looking around the corner for something that might happen that was similar to something in the past. All of this means that it is very, very hard for us to function from a peaceful and loving place. Okay? Part of the process, which I'll get onto in the next slide, of healing this stuff is how can we find and unpack those orphan parts and welcome them back in and integrate them so they don't have to be on high alert anymore. So many of our culture at the minute, we struggle with hypervigilance. We're always on the lookout for something, so we never get our certain nervous system a chance to just relax. Once again, no wonder alcohol, maybe weed, whatever it is. There's nothing wrong with drugs or alcohol. But if we're using it to try and achieve a sense of ease, there's an issue because I'll keep needing it unless I start to find that sense of ease and peace within myself. So I give you a couple of examples here around how this can happen with events that we might not normally perceive as traumatic. There might be a child in grade 2 who is in class and they have an answer to a question that they believe they know. They don't normally put their hand up, maybe a bit shy, and they put their hand up in class, and whatever happens, they get the answer wrong and everybody starts laughing at them. Okay, even the teacher, everyone in the class, all start laughing. There's a massive amount of fear and embarrassment that comes up in the system right there. They might look around, they might look at the teacher saying, will you be on my side? And they're not. So there's no resource there. It's like the world is against the child in that moment. That's then a potentially traumatic imprint. And if that child doesn't have a safe space that they can come home to and openly talk about what's happened and get that sense of safety and processing and completion, because most parents don't have that knowledge or ability, then the child can store that as an imprint. In that moment, along with the fear and the shame that came up, which is the emotional imprint, they can also create a narrative that it's not safe to speak up, which then becomes part of their identity from that day forward. It becomes a pattern in that person's life. So you can fast forward 15 years, 20 years, and that person's in a relationship and they know they need to speak up in the relationship because something's happened, their boundaries are being encroached, something's not fair, and they just need to speak up and just express their needs. And then the moment that person goes to speak up to their partner, all that fear and shame starts to come to the surface, that same belief becomes active. It's not safe to speak up, and we pull back. It's like we know we need to, but we pull back. Okay, same thing can happen at work. Maybe I know that I need to speak to my boss about something that's happening in the workplace or something that I actually deserve, and then I go to make that meeting or step into the boss's office, and that same thing, the orphaned part becomes active, and we pull back, we recoil. Okay, this is how these traumatic imprints can have a massive impact on all different areas of our life: relationship, work, family, friends, money, everything. the relationship with ourself, all of this stuff, that the ability to be alone, all of this stuff is so important when it comes to the outcomes that we have in our life. I'll give you another example. It's a good one. It's sort of, as I was planning this talk, it's one that I remembered from years ago, a client that I had. And he was a guy, probably mid to late 40s. And one of those, like I said earlier, one of those blokey guys, he would never have known what the word empath meant, let alone, being sensitive would have been seen as a weakness to him. And he came in and he was a go-getter. He was constantly grinding with his career, with his sport, with his work. Everything was just not 100%, over 100%. And it was causing so much stress in his life. And he was drinking, he was depressed, he was anxious, he couldn't sleep. And he had all this stuff going on. And we were starting to do some work unpacking where these imprints have come from. I was explaining it to him. And we went to a memory of his. It was really powerful. It's one that you would look at it and go, how could this be a traumatic imprint? But it really was, and really shaped the way he lived his life. He was a young kid, primary school, grade 1 or 2, something like that. His dad was this man that he looked up to. His dad was not one very easily to give love, right? A lot of men back in that day, right? Okay, so he was always craving his father's love. He always wanted to impress his father. It was kind of the number one prerogative. I was very much the same with my dad. And anyway, he had gone to school this day, and his dad had made him lunch, which was quite rare. He's like, oh, dad's made me lunch. Maybe the mum was busy or something. And he went to school and he realized that he'd forgotten his lunch. He left it at home. And he's like, oh, God, no. And his dad drove it in. His dad went out of his way to drive this sandwich into him at primary school so that he could have it that day. And so it gets to lunchtime. He's got the sandwich his dad made. He's sitting on the steps of a portable. And as he was getting it out of his lunchbox and unwrapping it, he dropped it in the dirt. So it was uneatable. And this memory caused so much stress and pain for him, because in that moment when he dropped that sandwich in the dirt, he decided that narrative was, I'm a complete disappointment to my father. Now, the reason that was important is because when we create a painful narrative, we believe that we are deficient in some way. So he was deficient in being able to impress or get the approval or love of his father. Whenever we feel like we're in a deficient state, we're going to try and overcompensate for that moving forward. It's called a shame-based pride overcompensation. And so what happened from that day, he decided, I'm a complete disappointment to my father. So the rest of his life, such a large part of his identity was based around trying to make up for that and do everything perfect and 100% and do it more than anyone else, just so his father would love him. Now, he didn't know that yet until we did this work. He didn't know why he kept having to impress everybody, but he was trying to make up for the fact that he didn't feel like his father was impressed by him. And the way that these traumatic imprints echo throughout time is that his father at this point had been dead for over 10 years. He passed away. Yet so much of his personality was still trying to impress his father, who was no longer with us for the past 10 years. And this was just a massive realization for him around the way he lived his life, all from the fact that he dropped a sandwich on the ground, right? So here's the thing. You would say, is dropping a sandwich on the ground traumatic? And nearly everyone you'd ask would say no. But trauma is very subjective. Trauma isn't the thing that happens. It is what happens inside of us as a result of what happens externally. Trauma is very subjective, okay? That kid that put the hand up in the classroom to speak up, that imprint isn't going to be a traumatic imprint for 10 out of 10 kids, but for 2 out of 10 kids it might be. Yeah, and I bet those 2 out of 10 kids are empaths. We are much more susceptible as empaths to store traumatic imprints, okay? Which means that our emotional load, the tax on our nervous system, becomes greater throughout time because it accumulates. I use the analogy with clients. It's like we're born with an invisible backpack, right? And as we go through life, every time we go through a highly emotional event that we aren't able to properly process and move through, we throw a rock in that backpack. And so we go through life and we're just chucking rocks in because we don't get taught. We don't get taught how to properly process and move through them. We don't even understand how our nervous system and our emotional body works. And so we accumulate. And, we grow up and we might, have a really good D&M with a friend or a family member. We might see that psychologist, and a few of those rocks might come out, but we're still putting them in. More's going in than is coming out, so that emotional load is greater. When that emotional load gets heavy enough, when that backpack becomes heavy enough, we start to get symptoms. And those symptoms can be depression, anxiety, bipolar, addictions, alcoholism, physical symptoms, disease. And so what happens, we need to start understanding that emotional load and how we can start lightening that backpack moving forward. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So I hope that's all made sense. And this is the elements of a traumatic imprint. Okay, this is the same for every human being, but the thing is, as empaths, we are more susceptible to these traumatic imprints. Okay, more things that happen will be, and so we should never ever compare. Like, I've worked with empaths in the past, and memories have come up. And they're like, "No, this can't be an issue. This was so small, right?" It's not. Okay. These things, if they're an issue, they're an issue. Comparing to someone else is the worst thing that we can do. I've worked with siblings before, and it's been really interesting. I even work with twins, and I would categorize one of them as an empath and one not so much. And they grew up at the same time in the same environment, same parents, same household, and they've got drastically different interpretations of their childhood and how their mum and dad were. Okay, simply because one of them was much more susceptible to a traumatic imprint than the other one. Okay, I'm going to finish up here by talking about some of the keys to healing. I really hope that this talk has been able to bring some awareness around the blocks and why we end up in difficult situations as an empath. Okay, but before we start moving forward with an issue or a problem, we need to understand why we're in the situation we're in. Okay, we need to understand, why do I feel so much heavier than other people? Why can people just brush things off and I can't? Why am I having issues with alcohol or depression and other people aren't? And they've been through worse things. Once again, forget the comparing thing. Comparison is the thief of joy, one of my favorite quotes. So in healing, everybody's healing path is unique, and you need to find that unique path if this is the journey that you are on, or maybe it's you are working with people, and this is kind of what I believe to be some of the key components around helping people move through these traumatic imprints. The first thing is creating some sort of somatic awareness. When we talk somatic, we're talking about the body. Okay, I've got a modality I created called embodied processing. The reason why it's called embodied is because our society in large part is disembodied. What does disembodied mean? Disembodied means I'm living up here in the mind. I'm living up here, I'm cognizing, I am interpreting, and I'm thinking about what I'm experiencing instead of experiencing what I'm experiencing. Okay, most human beings are like this. It's kind of bred in the culture that we live in. The reason why we become disembodied is because being in our body is uncomfortable. There's a lot of these traumatic imprints, there's emotional disturbance, there's nervous system activation and or shutdown, there's a lot going on. And so the natural inclination is to, when we come into the body, go, oh, don't like this, and then come back up into the mind. There's nothing wrong with that. Early on, you're going to keep popping back up into the mind. But as soon as we start to create some more somatic awareness around what's happening in our body and emotionally, the more we can create a better relationship with what's happening in there. Okay? We are in relationship to everything. We understand right now, yes, I'm in relationship to other people and situations and all that. We're also in relationship to every emotion that we have, every thought that we have, and every thought or emotion that we have ever had, we are in relationship with. Okay? What we need to do is we need to create more of a functional and working with relationship and not an adversarial relationship. This is where so many people get caught up. I'm sure you've all heard the term, whatever you resist persists. Whether it comes to feelings of anxiety in the body, feelings of sadness, feelings of guilt, as soon as we come into the body and feel those, we want to make them go away. Okay, so we have this adversarial relationship. This is bad, I want this to go away. All that does is makes things worse. They're either going to get worse in the moment, or they're going to get suppressed for a short amount of time and then come back with interest later. So we want to create this somatic awareness and start to work with the feelings and emotions and the thoughts that are happening as opposed to against them. So somatic awareness, a lot of you watching, you might be very somatically aware, but also want to let people know, like, You might not be. And that can be a process of taking a couple of times a day to drop out of the mind and to start to really pay attention to what I would call your somatic identity. Your somatic identity is not your interpretation of who you are. It's not, hey, my name's Ryan, I'm this years old, I'm a father, this is what I do for work. It's not that. It's not how you would describe yourself at a party. It's what it feels like to be you in your body in that particular moment. Okay? So if I drop into the body and there's just these feelings of guilt like coming up, that's my somatic identity right then. It doesn't mean it's always that way. It changes, but it's very important to honor what's coming up in that moment and not fighting the guilt or whatever comes up. Finding resource. I spoke about traumatic imprints go from potential to imprints without a resource. What we can do is we can start to find a resource within ourselves. We can start to cultivate a resource of safety. There's different methods of doing that. We can use areas of the body that feel more neutral than others. A really effective way is using a memory, a person, or a place from our past of a time when we did feel safe. Okay, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find gateways to a feeling of safety and support in our body. When we have a lot of imprints throughout our life, we lose that sense of safety. I didn't feel safe in my body for about 20 years. Okay, so we really lose that ground, that foundation of what we should have as a human being is feeling safe. We lose it. So we can start to use things like that as a gateway to start to access that feeling of safety. For me, I had a holiday house that my grandparents had around when I was the ages of maybe 7 to 10. And that holiday house just had a great feeling of safety. I loved going there. So I could use that memory and take myself back there and relive it. Our subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between an imagined event and something that's real. And so I start to feel those feelings of when I was younger again. Okay, those feelings of safety, of peace, of being free. And what I can do then, I can start to tap in and cultivate those feelings. Maybe for you, it's a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt or someone from when you were younger who whenever you were around them, you just felt safe. And you can use the image of them in your mind's eye to bring up to start to cultivate that again. Could be a specific memory from when you were 12 or whatever it was. But what we can do is we can start to, you're essentially planting a seed in the body. And then by going back there on a regular basis, we cultivate and water that seed so that this tree of safety and support will start to grow within us. The more, and then, because right now for most people that the scales are way out of balance. There's all the disturbance and traumatic imprints up here and the sense of safety in the body down here. So we get overwhelmed by life's happenings very, very easy. The more that we can build that resource of safety, and it can take time, but my God, it's worth it. The more that we can help welcome in these old parts. The next dot point I've got here is inviting in orphaned parts. From that ground of safety, we can welcome in those orphaned parts of when we went through very difficult times in our life, and we can welcome them back in to be processed and worked through. Once we welcome those back in, it's very, very important that we find the origin of whatever this imprint was. And we can generally trace that back, with a skilled practitioner, like the hand up in class. So someone might be coming in for a session around the fact that they can't speak up in their relationship. So they feel like they have a relationship problem. But by doing this work, they can find this imprint from grade 2 at school, putting their hand up, and then go, oh, that's why I can't speak up in relationship. Not my partner's fault, not the current circumstances' fault, just this imprint that I had stored. And then we can go about actually processing those sensations through the body. All of this work has to be done in the body very deeply, okay? Talking about things, we can find some relief in it, but for longer lasting change, this deeper work in the body is where we can actually start to resolve these imprints, because that's where they are stored, okay, in the body. And then integration. I spoke about an orphaned part being a split off part of the psyche. Part of the process of healing is actually welcoming back in those parts. Okay, I can make peace now that I've gone back. I've understood where this pattern and this emotion comes from. I've had someone take me through processing, working through the sensations in the body instead of keeping them in and suppressed to keep me safe. I can feel safe to let them go. I can understand that just because I put my hand up in class in grade 2 and all the kids laughed at me doesn't mean that I can't speak up in relationship now. I'm grown up now. I'm different. Okay. then we start to integrate. When we start to integrate, then all of a sudden the way we show up in our life changes. When I go to speak up to my boss at work, I don't have that. That fear might be just tiny or not at all now, or I can feel it and I'll step in there anyway. And I start to create new patterns in my life and new neurological pathways in the brain. So there are many different ways, that we can achieve this. Obviously, we teach embodied processing and root cause therapy at the Center for Healing as ways of doing this. There are other modalities out there that can do this. I know people who've had breath work followed by some talk therapy. There's group work. If people get into the right group with the right people and feel safe as a resource, incredible healing can happen. But it tends to happen with these steps in place. Okay, this seems to be the common theme when it comes to healing. So I really hope that you have enjoyed this talk and taken something away from it. If you would like to get in touch and connect with me further, there is our website there. It is courses.centerforhealing.com.au. All of our courses, practitioner trainings, and everything is on there. The Center for Healing on socials, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, I think we're on now. You can just search for us there. And if you have a specific question, you're welcome to get in touch with me, Ryan at thecenterforhealing.com.au. And like I said at the start, it is the greatest gift one human being can give to another is the gift of their attention. And I thank you so much for that. I hope this has been able to add value in some way. I really just want to understand that as an empath, it's very easy for us to fall into resentment, into depression, anxiety, addictions, coping mechanisms. But it's also very possible, and I think important for us to heal that, to move through that, so we can all of a sudden now have this empath gift that we have to give back to other people. And you will have your unique medicine that you're going to give to the world, and you're going to be able to best give that medicine once we have resolved and understood these traumatic imprints and how we end up in this situation. Because a healed empath is someone that radiates light to everybody they come in contact with, and my God, we need more people like that on the planet right now. Thank you again. My name is Ryan Hasson, and enjoy the rest of the summit. Much love.